Good Wednesday, a wet Wednesday here on the Current Word on WSHO Sunshine 800 AM. Welcome to the program. Trey Roberts here, sitting in on this substitutionary day of hosting as we continue to pray for our dear sister Kathleen that she have a speedy recovery and that she'll be back to doing cartwheels in the studio as she did once before as the host of the Current Word. So thanks for joining us today. Got a great program for you. Coming up in just a few minutes, we're going to jump on the phone with Dr. Michael Heiser. Go ahead and I'll give his introduction, if you will, now so that you know who he is, so that when he gets on the phone, we can jump right into his information. But Dr. Michael Heiser, if you're not familiar with him, he's got a lot of content out there. His website is drmsh.com, drmsh.com, and that's Dr. Michael S. Heiser, drmsh.com. But just a little bit about him. He has his MA in ancient history from the University of Pennsylvania, and he also has an MA and a PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic studies. He's got literally dozens of years of classroom experience in the college level. He's got several, definitely over a decade of distance education. He's currently the scholar in residence at Logos Bible Software. And if you're not familiar with Logos, or as all of the tutorials say, Logos Bible Software, a company that produces ancient text databases and other digital resources for study of the ancient world and biblical studies. If you go to his website, drmsh.com, and click About, you can get his all of his background information. As I have stated before, I stumbled across Dr. Heiser. I heard an audiobook of Supernatural, and just was bitten by the content bug of the Bible, and knowing that there was a lot more to it. There was someone who was out there willing to, as he puts it often, distill what is out there in academics and what is well known within the scholarly ranks, within universities and colleges and seminaries. And what's interesting is this is information that is known by people who have a high view of the Bible, as well as people who maybe have less than a high view of the Bible. But the great thing is that Dr. Heiser is, well, it would probably be an understatement to say that he's a Bible-believing Christian, but that is encouraging nonetheless. So let's go ahead and bring on the phone now our guest, Dr. Michael Heiser. Mike, welcome to the program.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. You sound great.
Okay, I can barely hear you, but I'll try to I'll see if I can get some earplugs in so I can hear you better, but go ahead.
Gotcha. Well, we appreciate you being on the program. And I did 3 hours, or I did 3 shows kind of outlining the basics of the content. So I kind of did your whole, if you're new to the content, start here information. We've gone through the Divine Council. We've gone through the Mosaic, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview stuff. What I'd like for you to do, if you could, is share with that filter shredding moment for you when you came across Psalm 82. If you could share that and your treatment of Elohim in that passage.
Yeah, that's, for those who haven't read the book, Unseen Realm, I put this in early because I like the way you put it, a filter that it certainly does for me. I was sitting in church one day. This was while I was in grad school at Wisconsin, and there was a guy there. We were just killing some time before the service, chatting away. And as I said in the book, I don't know what we were talking about. I don't remember that, but I'll never forget the way the conversation ended. He had his Hebrew Bible with me, and he handed it to me and said, "You need to read Psalm 82, just the first verse there in Hebrew." And I did, and it wasn't difficult Hebrew. Your audience is probably primed for the content of this verse now, but it's pretty simple Hebrew. Elohim Mitzvah Ba'adat El. God has taken his place taken a stand in the divine council. And then we have B'Kerav Elohim Yitzhak, in the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. So what my friend wanted me to notice was, hey, you have Elohim there occurring 2 times in the same verse. First one is singular, again, because he knew I could read Hebrew because of the grammar. It's a singular participle. Second one has to be plural. And we're used to thinking Elohim is the name of God. And, thousands of times, it is. It's a very generic term for the God of Israel. But here you have the God of Israel in this verse in the midst of plural gods in some sort of council. And I looked at that and I thought, well, that looks like a pantheon. I'd never, I had a lot of Bible under my belt. I'd taught a lot. I was in a PhD program in Hebrew studies, but I had never looked at that verse in Hebrew. And there it was. And I don't remember anything about the sermon that day because this became something I had to solve. It became, not just a filter spreader, but an academic orienting point for me because I couldn't let it go. I went out and I looked at, went to consult commentaries, kind of the first thing you would do. Well, what do the scholars say about this, especially if they're evangelicals? And I found, without exception, that evangelical scholars either didn't talk about it or they said something absurd like, oh, the Elohim here, the plural Elohim here are just people. And I knew enough that just was not a good explanation because in verse 6, the speaker, God, says to these other Elohim, he says, you are gods, Elohim, plural again, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince. And you don't tell humans, hey, you're going to die like a human. No kidding. We all die.
Right.
And what I found as I got into this was, critical scholars love this because this is the passage they go to justify ideas like, oh, the Israelites, including the biblical writers, were at one time polytheists and then they evolved into monotheism. So they were very good at ferreting out the ancient Near Eastern parallels. And I don't mean just like sort of fuzzy parallels. I mean word for word that occurred in Canaanite literature for what we were reading, what I was reading there in Psalm 82. And it was very obvious that this wasn't people. Because if you go over to Psalm 89, you have another reference there to a council. There's 2 words, Sod and Kahal, council of the sons of God. We saw sons of God in Psalm 82, verse 6, sons of the Most High. There is only one Most High, it's God's Bible. So here you have sons of God in Psalm 89 in a council of holy ones, and it's in the skies. Again, the last time I checked my Bible, we didn't have a bunch of humans ruling the nations from the sky.
Right.
It was just absurd, but yet this is where evangelicals went. They were trying to dismiss it, and the rabbis tried to dismiss it to the evangelicals and more or less just following the rabbinic lead there and so on and so forth. But providentially, I also had the thought pop into my head once I was directed to this that went something like, hey, I'll bet Jesus knew this verse. I'll bet Paul knew it. I'll bet all the apostles knew it. And, it didn't overturn any theological apple carts. So there must be an explanation to this. And I was basically on my own, to try to untangle this knot. And it became the focus of my dissertation. It became the focus of my academic research beyond that point. My specialty, so to speak, is sort of, the heavenly host and then divine rebels, what we think of as demons and other bad guys.
Right.
But this is where it all began.
Well, you say in your book, we're joined today, by the way, by Dr. Michael Heiser here on The Current Word on WSHO, Sunshine 100 AM. If you have a question, you can go to WSHO.com, click the watch and listen live button, jump in the chat room and post a question there. And if we can get it in, we'll get it to him during the program. You can also tweet me at TRob Radio, and we'll monitor that and take your questions there as well. Mike, you were talking about the material that, like, when you kind of found this was what, the early 90s?
Well, yeah, I started grad school in 95, so it would have been the late 90s.
So the Ugarit material, the Ugaritic material had not been, the trove had not been discovered. Is that correct? Is my timeline correct?
Right. Ugaritic material was discovered in the late 20s. So, it was deciphered pretty quickly because it is the closest linguistic counterpart to biblical Hebrew.
Okay.
That we know from the ancient world. So the material's been out really since the 30s, and critical scholars, what we would call, maybe a better term would be non-confessional, or people that didn't have any particular commitment to scripture or any doctrinal items like a believing Christian would. They've been all over this for decades, and it just never filters really into the evangelical academic discourse like at a seminary. Maybe if you're in a doctoral program in a seminary, you might get exposed to Ugaritic literature. I know nowadays you would.
Right.
Maybe 20 years ago you wouldn't, but if you're just doing pastoral preparation and MDiv program, this isn't the kind of thing that you're gonna encounter. And so I had not been exposed to it, but there it was. And when you take a class in Ugaritic, this is the stuff they want you to translate. You have to read articles on Ugaritic religion. You begin to see, the very close conceptual parallels between the two. And then the issue becomes, well, how do we parse that? And, this is just part of it, as I soon discovered once I got into it.
Now, this ancient Near Eastern material, all of the non-Hebrew stuff, does it predate, for the most part, most of the biblical material? And if so, is most of the Bible that cites, references, alludes to, draws from, is it some sort of polemic or like a setting of the record? Like the biblical authors are saying, listen, no, Marduk didn't slay a dragon and create the heavens and the earth. Here's how Yahweh did it. Is it as simple as setting the record straight?
Well, in some cases, that's what's going on. But let's take the chronological part of your question first. It really depends on the text. It's not so much something linked to language. Let's just take the flood example, you alluded to the creation story there, one of the creation stories from Babylon.
Right.
You could have a text of a creation story that dates to the 6th century BC. That's the 500s. Well, that's going to be later than a lot of biblical material. It's going to be prior to some. But that story might actually be preserved in a nearly identical form or a pretty similar form in earlier Babylonian or Akkadian or Sumerian literature. So it depends, what are you talking about, this tablet that I'm holding in my hand now, or are you talking about this being the latest version of a story that goes back a millennia earlier?
Gotcha.
It's not a neat question that's really sort of easily determined. And of course, the other side of that is, there's a wide disagreement on when biblical material was written. So you've got two sides going on. Sometimes pretty securely, when something in Scripture would have been written, when particular Akkadian or Egyptian or whatever it is composition would have been written. There are clues within the composition itself that will tell you that. But in many cases, you don't. When you do have after the fact, kind of things going on or contemporaneous, it is often the case where a biblical writer will take something kind of like a preacher would do today. Preachers preparing a sermon or delivering a sermon, and they'll pull something out of a newspaper, out of an article, off YouTube or whatever.
Right.
Something that they can kind of count on most of their audience being familiar with and therefore being able to connect to and then getting the point. Biblical writers would do that a lot with literature that they presumed a literate reader of their own material, whatever the biblical book happened to be. They could presume that, okay, when I drop this line, you're all going to know what I'm talking about and who I'm talking about and why I'm doing this. And so there's a lot of that kind of thing that goes on, and it does have apologetic or polemic purposes behind it on the part of the biblical writer.
Now, if these divine counsel ideas, I feel like so much of, especially of the Old Testament, to say that the Bible obviously has theological messaging in it, really goes without saying. It's kind of silly.
You would think.
Right. But like the ideas of the divine council, if they're influenced by some of the traditions or cultures of the ancient Near East, how is our acceptance of that concept to be viewed differently than, for instance, our ancient Near Eastern understanding of cosmology? In other words, if they were wrong about A, could they be wrong about B? Meaning, does God really operate within a divine council, or was he simply trying to convey to his people that he administers over them and that there's a certain level of governance in that idea?
Yeah, well, I would say the way you approach this is A, you recognize that the biblical writers were, drum roll please, people.
Human.
Were human.
Right.
And B, that the Bible didn't drop from heaven. In other words, God actually used writers living at a specific place and time.
Every time I have this question, Mike, I hear you explaining inspiration in my head.
Well, it has to do with a lot with how you view inspiration. You view inspiration either as a paranormal event, where the writer's mind basically goes blank and the writer plays a minimal or no role, and then God more or less whispers every word into their ear. You have automatic writing, and the writer doesn't realize what he's doing, and he wakes up and, oh, wow, I wrote that. I can't wait to read it. That's often how we're taught about inspiration. But if you strip the humanity out of inspiration, you really undermine the doctrine. And I have a big concern with that. God chose people. He asked people to do certain things. He providentially prepared people
Amen.
to write something down. Okay, and that's part of how we approach this. Now, to apply this to the divine council situation, every culture had, especially in antiquity when they weren't like post-enlightenment skeptics, every culture
Right.
believed that you have an active, animate spiritual world, and they assumed that world was organized, that it was populated by intelligent beings. And so the analogy for them, and the working metaphors for understanding the spiritual world came to be hierarchy, and typically royal hierarchy, because the gods are rulers naturally. They don't work for us, we work for them. They're above us, we're not above them. And so they just assume, okay, over in this world, we have intelligent people, and they like things done in an orderly fashion as opposed to chaos. They have competing agendas. They arrange themselves in a hierarchy to get things done. They make decisions. They expect those decisions to be carried out by lesser, beings, and so on and so forth. There's those in less authority. There's in some other role in society. And so this was a very normal way to look at the divine world, populated by intelligent beings as it was. Why would it be chaotic, and have no hierarchy? They couldn't have wrapped their minds around that at all. You say, well,
Right.
that's artificial. Well, on one hand, every way we think about the spiritual world, we have to use metaphors because we're not part of it. Saying that the council idea is metaphorical is not a denial that there is a supernatural world. It's how do we talk about that world? And in the Bible's case, we do believe in things like revelation and inspiration. But part of that, again, is, God doesn't step in and say, don't use that metaphor for describing what's going on in the supernatural world. I have to stop you. Stop it. Stop it.
Right.
He doesn't do that. He allows people, his writers that he chose under inspiration, to talk about the spiritual world in these ways. And I think, again, if we have a high view of God, we'd have to assume that was permissible. And frankly, that, God was fine with how they described these things, and it made sense to the readers, and it, I would say logically would, be consistent with the reality of it, because you do have, again, intelligence, and intelligence likes to do things intelligently, orderly, as opposed to chaotically, and having it all be a mess. So, we can grant that these are metaphorical statements, good, big deal. Again, that doesn't amount to saying that this world doesn't exist, because I can't think of a better way to talk about it. It must not exist. Again, that's absurd. But a lot of it goes back to how we're taught to think about God's role in choosing people and providentially preparing them to write, and then being present in the process at all times, from the time a writer that he knew was going to write was born, all the way up to the event of actually sitting down at a desk and putting it to a piece of papyrus or a piece of cloth or whatever. God was in the process, but we tend to strip the humanity out of it, and that's when we get into trouble, because then we can't explain, we think, why the biblical writers are behaving like humans. How else would they behave?
Right.
What else would they do? They're going to use words and word pictures, symbols, metaphors, figures of speech. They're going to use everything at their disposal, again, under the providential oversight of God, to express a given thought.
Absolutely.
And God's going to help them to do that.
All right, Mike, we're up against our first break, so we're going to go ahead and take that now. When we come back after the break, I want to ask you, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being absolutely certain, how personally certain are you in the date September 11th, 3 AD? All right, we'll get your answer when we come back after the break. 504-527-0800. With us today for the entire hour, Dr. Michael Heiser from Logos Bible Software. And this is The Current Word on WSHO Sunshine, 800 AM. We'll be right back.
Rock worldwide.
504-527-0800. If you have a question for our guest for this hour, Dr. Michael Heiser, you can go to his website, drmsh.com. Also, check out, if you're into podcasts, which most people are today, he's got a real good one. It's the Naked Bible Podcast. So if you go to the nakedbiblepodcast.com, you can check out all the episodes there. He does a weekly episode of that particular podcast. And he's, I think, 160 plus episodes at this point. But he also has another podcast called Peer-a-Normal. And this is where he takes a scholarly, peer-reviewed research approach to all things paranormal, things that people say and claim to have happened to them that are outside of normal explanation. And he actually pulls out some of the research in those particular areas and fields. And so that's another good one. You can go to iTunes, Google Play, I think Stitcher, any place where there is a podcasting service, you can subscribe, and I would suggest you do so. Also, if you go to drmsh.com, you can also subscribe to Dr. Heiser's weekly newsletter. What's great about this is you get to see all the things that he's doing, all the places that he's speaking. You also can get involved by prayer requests. Dr. Heiser puts in things that he needs prayer for and asking prayer for within the ministry. He has a nonprofit ministry called Miklat, and you can actually donate if you want to help to do some translation work of things that he's doing in different languages around the world. He's the author of Unseen Realm. If you go to Amazon.com and just type in his name, Michael S. Heiser, you'll see The Portent, The Facade. These are two fiction books that he wrote, but they're all based in a lot of incredible truths that develop in a really neat story, a two-part series. And you can also find, as he alluded to, The Unseen Realm and also Supernatural. And then his most recent book, well, maybe most recent print book, is a book called Reversing Hermon. And that's the forgotten mission of Jesus, Enoch, and the Watchers. And all of these are just phenomenal reads, and they will inspire you to get back into your text. Everything, and I'll just speak for me personally, everything that you've done, Dr. Heiser, and I know you've stated it as the goal from time to time in different talks that you've given, but really the work that you do really does drive and inspire me personally back to the text and to really lean on the authority of the text. So thank you for that. All All right, so let's go back to Dr. Heiser here. And before the break, we asked a quick question about that particular date. Dr. Heiser, before we tell him what that date is, let's get your answer on that certainty. How certain are you about that date?
Well, I'm going to have to spill the beans because you gave an AD date and you wanted to give a BC date.
Oh.
So I have zero confidence in the AD date.
Very good. That was not an attempt to trip you up, though.
No, you're referring to September 11th, 3 BC.
Yes.
I've stated before that I do think that is the birthday of the Messiah. I'll give it a 9 because I'm not omniscient. I have no trouble admitting that I'm not omniscient.
See, that's the humbleness that we've grown to love from you.
Well, and it's not hard. But the date comes from taking Revelation 12 as being the reference point for something Paul does in Romans 10. Okay, the quick version of this is, if you go back and read Romans 10, like around verse 15 through 18, Paul is talking about, how are people going to believe in Jesus unless they've heard? How are they going to hear unless somebody preaches to them? And he's setting up the problem, and of course the call for evangelism. And then he asked the question, have they not heard? And you expect them to say, well, of course they haven't heard, because this is what you're telling us to do. You go out and evangelize. But he actually says they have heard in Romans 10:18, which is really weird. And his proof text for that, Paul's proof text, is Psalm 19, specifically in verse 4, where it talks about their line goes forth throughout all the earth, and you say, what in the world is that? Or their voice goes out through all the earth. As you step through, because that's what Paul quotes. He quotes the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The Hebrew text says their line goes out through all the earth. And he says, what is that? Well, if you read Psalm 19, there are like 10 different verbs of communication for the stars in the sky and the sun and the moon and all this stuff. And it sounds like astrology. But what I think Paul is referring to is Revelation 12, at least. The content of Revelation 12 would have been written after Paul was dead. But I think the content became part of the Christian tradition. That is, if you go to Revelation 12 and you take it seriously, John is looking up at the sky and this is what he sees. The great sign appeared in heaven, and the woman clothed with the sun, the moon's under her feet. Over her head is a crown of 12 stars. She's pregnant, about to give birth. There's a red dragon at her feet waiting to devour the child when she gives birth. And the child is the Messiah, the one who would rule the nations with a rod of iron. Well, if you put that into an astronomy program, all those conditions, the sun is in the Virgin, the moon is at her feet, the Virgin is constellation Virgo. Plot that either over Babylon that they're looking at this, or Jerusalem. You're going to come out with a certain date for when all these things exist, and there are other things in the picture that are important, that account for Matthew 2, the movement to the star, which I think all astronomers would argue is the retrograde motion of Jupiter. Jupiter is in that vision. If you plot the elements of Revelation 12 in there, the king star, there's a conjunction with the king planet and king star there, Regulus and Jupiter. And all those conditions factor out to September 11th, 3 BC, which also corresponded to Tishri 1, which is the inauguration, the day of inauguration for a new king in the Jewish calendar, according to Israelite tradition. There are a number of other things that it coincides with that we don't have time to get into. But I think Revelation 12 is a good example of how it doesn't fulfill any prophecy. There's no Old Testament prophecy that says, hey, when the Messiah is born, you look for all this stuff. It's sort of an after-the-fact thing, or the way I take it is these are a set of conditions, signs in the sky, that accompanied the birth of Jesus, way back in Bethlehem. And this is the full picture. What the Magi see is one particular part of it. But if you plot the full picture out, this is the date that it produces. And people object to it and say, well, it can't be 3 BC because didn't Herod die, in
right.
4 BC and all this kind of stuff. Again, in my book, Reversing Hermon, I have a chapter on this. And basically there is recent scholars that, based on Herodian coins and a few other things, that point out the use of different calendars during the period. And according to one particular calendar, you can have Herod die in 1 BC that fits the picture. So the traditional date of Herod, there are problems with it. Nobody ever questions it. But there are serious problems with it. And a 1 BC date actually works very well with both Herod's life and also this particular picture in Revelation 12.
And to me, the most interesting part, and without going into a lot of detail, but it'll kind of segue into the next question, is that it's the traditional date of the birth of Noah.
Yeah.
And of course, Noah opens up, and the Noah material then opens us up to go where I wanted to go next, which is First Enoch. So, this is whether or not I agree with you totally. I mean, you've convinced me very, very easily actually on this one, that whether or not one Enoch should or should not be in the canon is doesn't take away from its importance. No one argues that Josephus's works should be in the canon, but yet we find it quite useful for understanding the content of the Bible. In the same way that 1 Enoch helps us to contextualize passages like Genesis 6, 1 through 4, or even to see in the New Testament, whether it be in the Gospels, Peter, Jude, Paul's writings, the over 60 allusions to First Enoch. Do other Second Temple writings help us to contextualize the Bible, for instance, in hard to understand passages? And the one that I'm thinking of in particular is like, does Jubilees help us to contextualize the life of Abraham, the understanding of the relationship with him and Lot, Esau, Nimrod, and ultimately why Esau gives up his birthright to Jacob in the Bible?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my answer to all that, including First Enoch, is what you get immediately is you get a sense for how the writer of any particular Second Temple book approached and interpreted something, in the Old Testament. And so I would say if what they're thinking and the way they're talking about what's going on there, if it is consistent with good exegesis in the Old Testament, that is, the text of the Old Testament can sustain what that particular author, in Second Temple period is saying. If the text can sustain it, then it's on the table, and it's a possibility. If it's just something, wild and ridiculous, that there's no way that you could be doing, serious work in the text, trying to, understand it, as sort of a, having its own time and place and context. If you're just, going somewhere totally different with it, then, I'm not going to pay too much attention to it. It might be interesting, but
right.
It's not the same level of something the text can actually sustain. And, like with Enoch again, I don't consider Enoch inspired, but again, to me, the question doesn't matter for the reasons that you stated.
Correct.
We don't wonder, well, is the Baal cycle inspired because Psalm 74 uses it? Is Genesis 1 and 2 inspired because they dip into Babylonian creation stories? We don't ask the question, could we have those in our Bible? So why are we so concerned about having Enoch in our Bible? Again, these were books that were used by the writers for a variety of purposes. And so if you read these books, you will become a more intelligent reader of your Bible. In other words, you'll be able to track on something that the original writer wanted his audience to track on. It just makes you a better reader. And in the case of First Enoch, it sounds a little odd, but First Enoch actually preserved the original Mesopotamian context for Genesis 6, 1 through 4. The story of the Apkallu in Mesopotamia is actually what Enoch is tracking on with his story of the Watchers at the flood, the sons of God in Genesis 6 talk. Enoch actually preserved that for us and say, well, how can that be? Because Enoch was written so much later. Well, there are lots of examples where Enochian writers, writers in the Second Temple period who write a lot of stuff that sounds like First Enoch, or First Enoch itself, actually quotes from Mesopotamian material. The best example is probably the Book of the Giants, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have Gilgamesh mentioned by name.
By name, yeah.
In that book. I mean, it's very evident that whoever wrote this material was familiar with Mesopotamian material. And in the case of First Enoch, it actually ends up giving us the context or Genesis 6:1-4. Why those 4 verses, as odd as they are even in the Bible? And again, I have 2 or 3 chapters about that in Reversing Hermon. It lays all that out. But these books are important because the biblical writers read them and they draw on them periodically to make certain points.
Now, we pray. Our guest right now, by the way, is Dr. Michael Heiser. His website you can go to is drmsh.com. And I would strongly recommend going to the nakedbiblepodcast.com and subscribing to that, as well as to his newsletter. By the way, with his newsletter, one of the benefits of that newsletter is there are articles and there is material that you hear that he references that once you sign up for the newsletter, you are then allowed to have access to on a file on Google Drive. And so all of these articles from journals that primarily don't get distilled down to the pews and to lay people, he makes those available for us. So that's probably one of the biggest benefits to that. If you're into the material, you want to know more. I remember I was driving to Orlando when I first started listening to the early episodes of the Naked Bible Podcast. I was going through all the baptism stuff and all the pre 2.0 stuff. And man, I was so frustrated. I was trying to listen to as many as I could listen to get caught up. And I missed the bibliography to the times when it was like, hey, if you sign up, you're going to get the Unseen Realm bibliography. And I was like, oh no, I missed that. Yeah. So, all right. So that being said, let's transition to a little bit different topic. When we pray in Jesus' name, we tend to, as Christians, we close out a prayer in Jesus' name, and then we close out the prayer. Would that be a modern equivalent to like New Testament references to the name of the Lord, or when Jesus said, like in the garden, I've kept them in your name? In other words, is the way we close prayer something that ancient people would have done when they prayed to Yahweh?
Yeah, I think that, in the Old Testament, if you look at Old Testament prayers, they do, again, use the divine name a lot. They'll use it sort of as more of a direct address as opposed to, something that's kind of like a benediction, like we do. But the whole idea is that you are, and you're trying to pray in concert with, the Lord's will. And so you're appealing, again, to his own authority. When you pray something in the name of Christ, you're doing so because you have aligned yourself with him. You are, not only God's imager, but you are an imitator of Christ. And you are part of, his body. He is your representative head. You come to God through him in Christ's authority, and so on and so forth. I do think it's that's the authority element of it, but I do think there's also an element of, what I call an unseen realm, the name theology, where the idea of bearing the name has really everything to do with imaging God. We are, so it's an ownership idea as well as just a representation idea. But when we pray in this manner and we try to, sort of remind God as if he needs reminding of all these things, he's done, how he came to men in the Old Testament as a man, and that man had the name, God's own name, his own essence in him. Then through the incarnation, that sort of upped the ante. It wasn't just a physical representation of God. Now we have an incarnation moment where God becomes man, born of a woman. All this sort of stuff that we sort of remind God that we know these things, we align ourselves with these things, we accept that Jesus was the name in flesh, and we are praying, based on his authority and on the outcome of your own program, Lord, for these things. So I think it's great to keep those things in mind because there's a theology behind not only the fact that we're supposed to pray, but essentially how we think about the whole enterprise and how we try to get our will in concert with God's will.
All right, Dr. Heiser, we're going to take our last break, and then we'll come back with a rapid-fire closeout to the hour. This thing goes by really quick on radio. Pay a couple of bills, and phone lines are wide open if you have some questions. And I know I still have a couple of more before Dr. Heiser goes. 504-527-0800. This is The Current Word on WSHO. We'll be right back.
Future of America is at stake, and frankly, many Americans are frightened at the direction we're taking.
504-527-0800. Trey Roberts with you here on The Current Word. And we've been joined for the hour with Dr. Michael Heiser. You can go to his website, www.drmsh.com. You can also subscribe to the Naked Bible Podcast, Peer, a normal podcast. You can pick up his books, top 3 that I would throw out. Actually, you know what? I dare you not to bore me with the Bible. It was such a good read. I'm looking forward to, I heard the announcement, looking forward to the second one coming out. That one was so much fun just because of the stuff that people get tangled up with. But I want to do kind of a rapid fire with you here. So these are all going to require sort of abbreviated answers so we can get as many in as possible. But I'll let you abbreviate as much as you deem necessary. All right, let's see here. Joseph Smith, was he tracking on the Divine Council stuff before Mormonism just completely fell off the tracks?
I probably don't know enough about his early views to say that. I guess it's conceivable he could have seen divine plurality in the Hebrew Bible, because the King James Version really does a nice job of translating Psalm 82:1. So maybe he saw that and sort of spun out of control. I don't know.
Because their treatment of Elohim as a name of God as opposed to realm distinction, it just seems like they, not being an expert in Hebrew, maybe got that a little conflated. I don't know.
Yeah, for Mormons, I've actually critiqued Mormonism's use of Psalm 82 in an article published by a Mormon journal, believe it or not, at their request, which is probably even more surprising. But so people can get it for free online. It's called, just put in my last name, Heiser, and the title is "You've Seen One Elohim, You've Seen Them All?" ? And my critique is that, look, Mormonism basically says all these Elohim are interchangeable; they're all the same. And that is not what a biblical writer would believe. Yahweh is species unique. He is distinct among the Elohim. They distinguish him by virtue of a number of ways. He's talked about by the biblical writers in ways that no other Elohim is talked about. So it really sort of goes off the rails. This is why you get Jesus and Satan being brothers and all this kind of thing in Mormonism. It's because they level the playing field through this term Elohim, that they're all, when you've seen one, you've seen them all, kind of thing.
That's great. In fact, your story when you preached back in April about that conversation with that Mormon scholar who came and actually listened to you read that paper was quite interesting. When Jesus re-embodied Legion from the demoniac, from the man into the pigs, and then the pigs killed themselves, what happened to Legion? Did he just become disembodied again? Or was there a death that took place because it was a disembody, re-embody, death again sort of thing?
Yeah, I would say it's disembodiment. And the reason I say that is because there are Old Testament passages. We did a whole episode of the podcast on the judgment of the gods, like in Isaiah 34, Psalm 82, some of these other passages. The permanency of the judgment of all divine beings that are in rebellion, that are hostile to God, is an eschatological one. It's associated with the day of the Lord. So that's why I would answer it that way.
Gotcha. And it probably also is why we get the a demon comes back to a cleaned house with 7 times greater. Is that theologically telegraphing kind of that same concept that they're going to be hanging around until the Lord finally does away with them?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. Wow, that's pretty good. I didn't expect that. Okay, so the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmudic treatment of Jesus, they're not very fond of Jesus in the Talmud, to say the least. He's we do have FCC rules to follow here, so he's a blaspheming heretic. Mary and Pantera, the whole story, the Roman centurion, he's boiling in excrement as we speak. So their treatment of Jesus, does that make the geopolitical state of the nation of modern Israel, does it make it more anti-Christian and therefore less eschatologically important than the majority view of the modern church?
Yeah, I don't think we can take what a select handful of Jewish thinkers in the Middle Ages, the medieval period, the Talmud, what they said about Jesus as being representative of the way any given Jew would be thinking about Jesus now.
So the Talmud was not Second Temple period.
No, Talmud is later.
Ah, okay. All right. See, that clarifies a lot.
But even the bad stuff said about Jesus is actually pretty useful theologically, because it's one of those things where, when you get people come along and say, "Oh, there's no historical evidence that Jesus ever lived." Well, I mean, here you have people writing in late antiquity, and if it would have been so self-evident that this guy Jesus was like a myth, that he never really existed, why don't the people in the Talmud just say that? Instead, they call him a magician and a sorcerer, which sort of implicitly says he did some spectacular things, even though they hated him.
Right.
And they say other bad things about him, but they don't deny his historicity. Is the point. So that's a pretty, it's not a completely contemporaneous witness. I mean, you have other things that get to that level chronologically. But here you had a really good chance among Jewish scholars who would have had every reason to just say, "What are you people talking about? This guy never existed." But they don't.
Right.
They don't go there.
Yeah, it's not too uncommon of how Allah tells Muhammad that if you doubt any of the things that I'm telling you, to check with the people of the book. So the fact that Allah is telling Muhammad that Muslims in the future, according to the Quran, should check with the Bible means that Allah at least thought that the Bible written at the time of the Quran was not corrupted yet. So it kind of breaks down the Muslim apologetic against Christianity, but, nevertheless. Is Colossians, the language of Jesus being the fullness of the glory of God, is that being drawn from some of the glory language that we see in the Old Testament?
Yeah, I think it is. And if you remember on the podcast, we went through Ezekiel. And if you compare, for instance, Ezekiel 1, you have this vision of the glory that is described as a man, at least from the waist down. You never get a description of the face, but seated on this throne. And it's referred to as the glory of the Lord. But then later, in chapter 10, for instance, and in other places, you have the one on the throne referred to as the God of Israel. So again, you have God in human form in this idea. But nevertheless, God in human form is associated with the phrase, the glory of the Lord. And I do think, again, that there are connections between that idea, God comes as a man, and that is the glory, come as a man, and the way Jesus gets talked about.
All right. I don't have, I'm struggling to keep up with my my Dr. Heiser Hebrew course personally. Just between you and I. So I can't go in front of a group of Christians and say things like the following. This is the way that the ancients thought. Because you've studied it, you're familiar with the cultures, the writings, the ways, the linguistics of it. How can a non-specialist better articulate this idea without coming across as, trust me, I heard a guy on YouTube say X, Y, or Z?
Well, I think we can get a good ways down the road by using, the kind of tools that we make, where I work, at Logos, reverse interlinears, that sort of thing, and even traditional interlinears and whatnot. Ultimately, knowing what a given person thought really requires two things. If we can, whittle it down to two. One is you're very capable of finding out what that Hebrew word is behind that English word if you have a tool like an interlinear or a reverse interlinear. And then it's just a matter of looking up the usage of that word in context. That will tell you how the person was thinking based upon how they use certain words. But part of that, and it's sort of the missing part, is to get more of the worldview of the person using those words in your head. In other words, sort of the framework, the life framework, the way they would have thought about reality as they understood it back then. Because that's going to guide and steer, and in some cases, steer them away, from using a word this way and not that way. So you do need to have, the worldview, worldview knowledge, worldview framework, and you can get that. It just takes work, not magic. It just takes work. There's lots of resources for doing that. And Unseen Realm, this is why I referred to Unseen Realm in the introduction as the starting point. Unseen Realm is not the end point. It is the starting point. I will give you the lay of the land, matrix of ideas, and then if you have that in your head, you'll be able to start drilling down and expanding upon it. So you need worldview, and then you need to just have tools that get you to how biblical writers use words in the context of what they're writing.
All right, so you teach us, Dr. Heiser, to never do Bible study with a newspaper, or at least it's not the wisest thing to do.
Not a good hermeneutical.
Right. But do you find it at least bit interesting that there's so much contentiousness in 2017 over some land in the Middle East, number one, and that number two, that there's a United Nations station at the only one in the world that is manned 24 hours a day, 365 days a year at the top of Mount Hermon. Is that interesting to you at all?
No, I think that's interesting. When I hear things like that, most of the time, people don't need evil divine intervention to do evil. We're quite capable of screwing things up ourselves. It's fine,
right?
And being who we are as fallen beings is just fine. But I do believe that there are some people who this is their faith and they give themselves over to it.
Wow.
Thinking that they will benefit from it and be able to control it. So that's how I look at oddities like that.
Gotcha. Thank you, Dr. Heiser, for being with us for this hour. Again, go to drmsh.com and subscribe to the Naked Bible Podcast, as well as the Paranormal Podcast. Pick up Reversing Hermon, Unseen Realm, Supernatural, all of it on Amazon.com. We'll see you next time.